The documentary scene that has been clearly established that the Irish were the first immigrants in the United States of America to be involved in organised crime points to these famine victims that got off the boats and became basically dependent on nothing else but crime, so they became these notorious characters that ruled the streets of New York. But the reality is that maybe they arrived in a city that was already crime-ridden, run by Irish Americans or even Irish immigrants themselves. The Irish arrived in New York, the famine victims. They arrived in a city that was already controlled by Irish gangs. Definitely the Kerry people were controlling it, and also people that possibly came from Dublin. And these were not famine victims. They were actually just criminals. Even in modern day, the statistics show that the Irish were one of the largest ethnic groups to land in New York, and they had been going there since 1845 and previous times beforehand. But in 1845, from that particular time, it is estimated that 1.5 to 2 million Irish had landed in New York. They would have dwelt around places like the Bronx, Hell's Kitchen, as is said, Lower East Side of New York, and they would have been gone to Philadelphia and obviously Boston and as far reaching San Francisco. But in New York, they basically got a different name for themselves, and the story isn't only about how they became confronted with a horrendous situation, but also how they rose out of it in that particular city.
By the mid-1800s, the Five Points was known primarily as an Irish neighborhood. The common opinion was that the Irish were criminal by nature. They had fled from their own country because of the famine. And the horrifying slum conditions and pervasive crime of the Five Points only contributed to that attitude. While the Five Points was predominantly an Irish neighborhood in the 1850s, there were also African Americans and several other immigrant groups. The Old Brewery, a big structure that had been a brewery in colonial times. It became an infamous landmark in the Five Points. Allegedly up to 1,000 poor people lived in the Old Brewery, and it was said to be a den of unimaginable vice, including gambling and prostitution and illegal saloons. In the 1850s, the building was demolished and the land was handed over to a mission whose purpose was to try to help neighborhood residents.
Ireland in the 1800s was not a peaceful land. There was the Whiteboys. The Whiteboys were a secret Irish rural organisation in 18th century Ireland who used brutal ploys to protect tenant farmer land rights for subsistence farming. Their name derives from the white smocks that members wore in their nightly raids. Because they levelled the fences at night, the authorities hailed them levellers. They sought to address rack rents, tithe collection, excessive priests' dues, evictions, and other oppressive acts. As a result, they targeted landlords and tithe collectors. Over time, Whiteboyism became a general term for violence connected to secret societies. In November 1761, the first extreme outbreak from the Whiteboys occurred in County Limerick. These furies instantly spread to counties Tipperary, Cork, and Waterford. They had put a wide order of planning into the revolution, because they held regular gatherings for specific grievances. As their numbers increased, the Whiteboy activities widened, and proclamations were clandestinely posted under such names as Captain Moonlight, the stipulating demands such as that rent not be paid, that land with expired leases not be rented until it had lain fallow for 3 years, and that no one pay or collect tithes demanded by the Anglican Church. They also sent threatening letters to debt collectors, landlords, and occupants of land gained from eviction.
Henry David Inglis, a Scottish journalist, visited Ireland in 1834. In 1835 he published a book based on what he witnessed. It was hugely successful. The travelogue he wrote showcased a sense of social justice of that time, the wretched scenes he saw in Limerick city. The old town was seared into his memory. In one part of the city, there was great wealth and the other desperate poverty. The following segment of his record compares these different actualities. Despite being instructed beforehand that the poor of Limerick city were in the most critical condition, he was shocked by what he found. I found too dreadful confirmation of the very worst reports. I spent a day in visiting those parts of the city, where the greatest destitution and misery were said to exist. I entered upwards of 40 of the abodes of poverty, and to the latest hour of my existence, I can never forget the scenes of utter and helpless wretchedness that presented themselves that day.
Established here is that it's not only important to understand who was in New York while these famine victims arrived, but also who were these famine victims and where did they arrive from.
Henry David Inglis continues, the inmates were some of them old, crooked, and diseased, some younger, but emaciated, and surrounded by starving children, some were sitting on the damp ground, some standing, and many were unable to rise from their little straw heaps. In scarcely one hovel, could I find even a potato.